Welcome to our third and final session of From Eastern Europe to the Lower East Side, the class where we are exploring migration and settlement of the Jews from Eastern Europe in America between the years 1880 and 1924. In our first class session together, we examined the push-pull factors of Jewish immigration. And then last week, we looked at the communities and organizations, the lives that this group of immigrants built, chiefly on the Lower East Side of New York. Today, in our final session together, I want to put this community in context. And when I say put them in context, I mean that I want to put this wave of immigrants in the context of American Jewry to see how the new arrivals interacted with the existing American Jewish community, and to see how the whole American Jewish community, this whole enlarged American Jewish community, the Eastern Europeans, plus everyone who was already here, behaves in the context of world Jewry. So the years that we've been talking about, the years 1880 to 1924, are a time of tremendous change. The arrival of millions of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe changed American Jewish life, and it also changed the position of American Jews on the world stage. So our mission for tonight is twofold. I want to explore these changes first at home and then more globally. So let's start with changes at home in America. This is a topic that we've touched on in previous weeks because you guys have been very curious. You have asked about how the existing American Jewish community received this influx of millions of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So tonight we're digging into this relationship. Ooh, I've got an echo. Let's see if I can mute that person. Okay, I think we got it. So tonight we're going to dig into that relationship between the kind of native Jewish community and the newcomers, uptown and downtown. In short, the Germans and the Russians. And we'll begin to think about that relationship. We'll begin looking at it in New York Harbor, where there was a kind of symbolic meeting of these two factions, native and newcomer. Immigrants to the United States who arrived in New York Harbor after 1886 sailed past the Statue of Liberty, and the Statue of Liberty sat on a pedestal that, as of 1903, was engraved with a poem by an American Jew, Emma Lazarus. So all of these immigrant Jews who sail into New York Harbor, who after 1886 are looking at the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of welcome and freedom, are also, whether they realize it or not, being greeted by the words of a member of the American Jewish community, Emma Lazarus. And Lazarus's words, which are certainly familiar to all of us, but just in case you need a reminder, they're up there on the slide. These words were actually inspired by the charitable work that she did with Russian Jewish immigrants. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, your tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. With this poem, Lazarus expresses both invitation and judgment. Invitation and judgment, an attitude that is going to come to define the relationship between American Jewish natives and newcomers. Do you see the invitation here, the welcome in her words? You can see it, I think, most clearly in the verbs. Give us, right? Send us. We will lift up the lamp to guide you through the golden door of liberty and opportunity. But there's also judgment here. And that you can see, first of all, in the adjectives, right? The immigrants are the wretched refuse, which basically means the garbage of Europe. And when we are holding the light, we, the Americans who are already here, are holding this light to guide the immigrants, to enlighten the immigrants. You can see, I think, how this kind of attitude might seem offensive to Russian Jews, well, really to any immigrants. Emma Lazarus is actually the perfect person to start with tonight because she represents the possibilities for Jews here in America. Her experience as an American Jew highlights the possibilities for Jews here. She shows us how much some American Jewish families had achieved by the end of the 19th century, and consequently, how much they stood to lose should the arrival of millions of Russian Jewish immigrants challenge the place of Jews in America. Now, the Lazarus family was descended from several of America's founding Jewish families, the first Jewish settlers who came here in 1654. Some of us studied these settlers together in the very first series that I did for Westchester Reform. And as a descendant of these pioneering Jews, who happened to be Sephardic, Emma Lazarus belonged to a kind of distinct Jewish upper class. Her ancestors were founders of two important colonial congregations in the United States. They founded the Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, which some of you may have visited. If you haven't and you find yourself in Newport, it's well worth a visit. They were also founders of the very first synagogue in New York, the Sephardic Shereth Israel Synagogue. The Lazarus family had deep Jewish roots in America, and they served as leaders of the Jewish community here. They were also prosperous and active members of the larger secular community. Emma's father, who was called Moses Lazarus, was a successful sugar refiner, and he founded, together with the Vanderbilts and the Astors, the elite Knickerbocker Club in New York City. He built a summer house for the Lazarus family in Newport, Rhode Island, and you can see a picture of the Lazarus' summer house up there on the slide. And Newport, Rhode Island was the place for fashionable New Yorkers to go to escape the heat of the city in the summer. And right up there with the Vanderbilts and the Astors, the Lazaruses had a house. These were fancy people. Emma and her 7 brothers and sisters grew up in a townhouse in New York's Union Square, where they were educated by private tutors in mythology and music and American poetry and European literature, and they learned German and French and Italian. Emma Lazarus herself was a writer from an early age. Her first volume of poetry was published at the age of 17, and shortly after that volume was published, she began a regular correspondence with Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous transcendentalist philosopher, Emerson would eventually become her mentor. Lazarus would go on to write about a dozen books and collections of essays and a lot of newspapers in both a lot of newspaper articles in both the Jewish press and the general press, and all of this writing would win her a spot in New York's literary elite. She wrote her most famous poem, the one I just read to you a few minutes ago, The New Colossus, which appears on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. She wrote that in 1883 for an auction to raise money to build the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. Her writing during this period, in this poem, in the numerous essays that she wrote that were published in newspapers, all of her writing railed against prejudice and intolerance. She volunteered for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. She helped to establish the Hebrew Technical Institute, which was a vocational training school for new immigrants. Emma Lazarus was a stunningly successful Jewish American who responded with interest and compassion and activism to the issues of her day, including the plight of Russian Jews and rising anti-Semitism, both in America and abroad. For someone like Lazarus, for someone like Emma Lazarus, and this would prove true for much of the American Jewish elite, the best way to curb rising anti-Semitism, which to them it seemed was only exacerbated by the visibility of the huddled masses, the wretched refuse, the best way to curb anti-Semitism was to Americanize these immigrants as quickly as possible, to remake them in the image of the established American Jew, so that these new immigrants could fit in and could reap the benefits of this country. This attitude is perhaps best summed up by the unofficial slogan of the Harmony Club in New York, the most prestigious German Jewish social club in the United States in 1900, and their unofficial motto was more Polish, less Polish. To this end, the established American Jewish community, some of whom were Sephardic like Emma Lazarus, but most of whom were of German origin, organized programs aimed to Americanize the Russian newcomers. These programs met with varying degrees of welcome and success. And I want to spotlight two of them for you tonight: the Industrial Removal Office and the Educational Alliance. And as I describe these programs to you, I want you to think about how they skirt the line between helpful and hostile. Okay, let's start with the Industrial Removal Office, or as they referred to themselves, the IRO for short. American Jewish leaders created the Industrial Removal Office in 1901 to move unemployed Eastern European Jewish immigrants from New York City and to relocate them in smaller cities within Jewish communities where there were job opportunities throughout the United States. From its inception in 1901 until it closed down in 1922, the IRO sent 79,000 Russian Jews to more than 1,000 American towns and cities to take jobs there as carpenters and shoemakers and butchers and blacksmiths and farmers and locksmiths, clerks, machinists, paper hangers, tanners, furriers, printers, watchmakers, weavers, and woodcutters. The IRO enlisted the cooperation of local Jewish communities to secure employment for the immigrants and to find them housing, and also to help ease their settlement into these new communities. The central office in New York City was staffed and funded by German American Jews who believed that areas of dense Jewish settlement, like the Lower East Side, perpetuated a distinctly foreign lifestyle. Relocated to the interior of the country, the Eastern European immigrant, they reasoned, would lose their foreign connections more quickly. They would not be able to depend upon a Yiddish-speaking milieu. They would be forced to acculturate more rapidly. This German Jewish enthusiasm for social engineering was not always shared by its potential beneficiaries. Jewish ethnic enclaves, like the Lower East Side and American big cities, provided anchors for new immigrants. Urban Jewish neighborhoods supplied familiarity and friends and relatives and synagogues and kosher meat and Hebrew teachers. Quote, "If I were still in New York," wrote a Russian Jewish immigrant who the IRO placed in a small town in South Carolina, "I could go to the Yiddish theater in the evenings. I could hear a lecture. I could visit people whose conversation I enjoy, join a club, or take an active part in some movement. In short, after working hours, I could be a man." The absence of wider Jewish fellowship and limited cultural opportunities in small towns discouraged immigrants from relocating there. Settled Jewish residents of small towns and smaller towns and cities were also not always so happy with the idea of Russian Jews coming to work there. And there's this very funny exchange of letters that you can read in the Center for Jewish Archives collection for the IRO between this farmer, this very disgruntled farmer called Leon Blum, who lives in New Jersey, who's really not happy about the Russian immigrants who the IRO keeps sending him to work on his farm. And this is a quote from one of these letters from Mr. Blum to the IRO. Quote, "Now, if you come across an Austrian or a Hungarian man that wants to come work on my farm, I will pay him what he is worth and I can employ him the whole year round. But I do not like for you to send me any more men who come from Russia." Now, Mr. Blum was a German Jew himself, and he was concerned, he explained, with what his Christian neighbors would think of the Russians, who he described as lazy anarchists. So, given all of this, it was soon apparent to the German Jewish elite that in order to really effect large-scale change, they would need to meet immigrants in their own neighborhoods. One of the largest and the most important agencies to attempt this was the Educational Alliance. From 1889 until today, it still exists today, the Educational Alliance served as the original settlement house on the Lower East Side. Its founders and funders included members of the German Jewish elite, so people like Isidor Straus, who founded Macy's department store, Jacob Schiff, who was a famous banker, Cyrus Adler, who was a scholar, and Morris Loeb, who eventually was a lawyer, and the Greenbaum family, too, also lawyers. These were some of the German Jewish philanthropists who got the Educational Alliance started and who also, frankly, contributed a lot of funds to the IRO. In its early decades, the Educational Alliance was an important source of help to the Eastern European immigrants, as well as a major source of friction and hostility between uptown and downtown Jews. The uptown German Jews poured money and time and energy into the Alliance's Americanization programs, but the sincerity of their efforts was accompanied by an attitude of cultural arrogance that made the whole package less appealing. For example, the Educational Alliance installed a rooftop garden in an effort to overcome, quote, the reluctance that Russians have to engage in physical work. The Alliance also offered lectures on hygiene and virtue that were meant to clean up people who they saw as dirty and distrustful. And the Alliance created a people's synagogue for immigrants to worship in, but this synagogue on the property conducted services in Hebrew and German for people who spoke Yiddish. So these programs were not always helpful and often were offensive to the Russian newcomers. Luckily, the Educational Alliance had a change of leadership, which led to a change in attitudes in the early 20th century when a man called David Blaustein took the helm. And under Blaustein's leadership, the formal stated objective of the Educational Alliance remained rapid Americanization, but the daily programs became more responsive to immigrants' actual needs. And the difference here, I think, is that Blaustein himself was a Russian Jewish immigrant. He had come almost 2 decades before he took the helm, and he was one of these immigrants who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and ended up going to Harvard and getting a degree there. And he came back to run back to New York to run the Educational Alliance. And he was really sensitive as an immigrant himself to other immigrants' desire to retain their cultural support, like their language, like their folkways, like their religious rituals and rites. And so to this end, under his direction, the Educational Alliance began to offer classes in Yiddish. Prior to Blaustein, Yiddish was banned on the premises. After Blaustein took over, they started offering classes in Yiddish, which proved extremely popular. Belt makers, buttonhole makers, carpenters, cutters, cloak makers, cigar makers, embroiderers came regularly to classes in history and religion and music and art and English. One of the main things they did was teach the English language, but they started to teach it in Yiddish, all of these classes in Yiddish, which made them way more accessible to the actual people living in this neighborhood. By the way, they had a really fine art school at the Educational Alliance, and some of the most famous American visual artists of the mid-20th century, including names that you might recognize, Chaim Gross, Ben Shahn, Moses Sawyer, Joe Davidson, Leo Gottlieb, just to name a few, went through the art school at the Educational Alliance, and I put a couple of their representative pieces up there on the slide for you to take a look at. So the Educational Alliance under Blaustein really started to serve the immigrant community better. It really met them where they were at. And in addition to all of the classes that I mentioned and the art school, the Educational Alliance started to offer vocational training. It offered inexpensive, healthy lunches. It offered free medical examinations and free summer camps for children. So as Eastern European Jews started to play a more important role in managing the alliance and in funding the alliance, they were able to organize it to better meet the needs of the community. And as I said, it's important to note that the Educational Alliance still exists today. It is still headquartered in the building that you see on the slide at 197 East Broadway. It still serves communities in Lower Manhattan, where it offers events and programs and critical services for people of all age. There's a fitness center there, there's a preschool, an art school still, a teen center, and there is a program for older adults. So as you can see from the examples, I think, of the IRO and the Educational Alliance, the dynamics of the relationship between the Germans and the Russians, between uptown and downtown, between native and newcomer, were complicated. There was true concern and sympathy and willingness to help among the uptown Jews, but the methods that they used to deliver that help were not always sensitive or appreciated. Several factors contributed to easing the strain between these two segments of the American Jewish community. And the most prominent factor that helped to ease that strain was World War I. Now, in my opinion, we don't spend enough time studying World War I in Jewish history classes because World War I is a determinative event in Jewish history. It has a huge impact on world Jewry generally and American Jewry specifically. I want to just start with basic facts and geography here for a minute. World War I, we remember this, conflict between major European powers, right? It's about colonial possessions, it's about boundaries, it's about economics. It begins in 1914, it lasts till 1918, and it ends with the Treaty of Versailles. Why does this matter in Jewish history? It matters because World War I marks the end of four great empires that together were the home to the majority of world Jewry. So you can see this up on the screen. Which empires come to an end or collapse during or as a result of World War I? The Tsarist Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Reich. Together, these empires were home to the majority of world Jewry, and these empires also contained the eastern and western fronts of the war. So logically, it follows, right, that large concentrations of Jews lived in the principal areas of fighting during World War I. For example, for the Jews living in Russia's Pale of Settlement, the ones we've been following all along here, for the ones who didn't come to America, but the ones who stayed behind, World War I was an unimaginable tragedy. It was a catastrophe. The battlefields of World War I overlapped the Pale of Settlement because remember the Pale, when we looked at it on the map, it is that western border of Russia, right? So the march and the countermarch of armies hopelessly disrupted organized Jewish life in the Pale of Settlement. The Pale was the front, one of the fronts in World War I. So during the Russian retreat in the winter of 1914 and 1915, when the Russians are retreating back, they're moving east and the Germans are moving in, all of this fighting is happening right around the Pale of Settlement, and the Russian army decides that the Jews could not be trusted to remain in territory invaded by the Germans because they might defect, right? We talked about this the first week too. Border territories are always vulnerable territories. So what happens is that a general in the Russian army by the name of the Grand Duke Sergei orders that all Jews be systematically expelled from the Pale. So there's this rapid invasion by the Germans, which prevents total expulsion, but not before 600,000 Jews are forcibly driven from their homes in the Pale further into the Russian interior. Historians think about 100,000 Jews died during this forced march, which is known as the Great Expulsion of 1915, mainly from starvation and freezing to death on the roads. To aid their displaced and impoverished brethren in Russia, but also in Palestine, which was suffering with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, in Germany, where there was fighting and the Reich was collapsing, in Poland, which is newly reconstituted after the war, and in Hungary, Jews around the world established welfare organizations on a scale previously unknown. American Jews from all walks of life, Jews from Wall Street banking firms and Fifth Avenue mansions, Jews from the Lower East Side sweatshops and tenements, Midwestern, Western, Southern Jews, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Socialist, men, women, and children, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, all of them raised money to help Jews who were caught in the war zones. Originally, at the beginning of the war in 1914, there were 3 different American Jewish relief organizations that were founded and competed for funds. Now, this should not be surprising to any of us, right? When we understand how the Jewish community works, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And there were also, as I had just been describing to you, all these different factions of Jews living together downtown. So the Germans had their relief agency, the Eastern European Socialists had their relief agency, and the Eastern European Orthodox Jews had yet another relief agency. And all 3 of these organizations, for all of their social and economic and religious differences, shared the same basic goal: to help Jews in the war zone. To this end, they did something extraordinary. They agreed to collect contributions from their respective constituencies and to pool them and then collectively disperse those funds throughout the world, which is great. And the activities of this organization, they decided to create one organization to dispense all of these funds, and that organization would be called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or as it was often called for short, the Joint, or the JDC, also an organization, of course, that continues to exist until this day. The Joint, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, was established in 1914 to gather and send abroad money and supplies for Jewish war relief. By contributing generously to feed and clothe and house the suffering Jews of Europe and Palestine, American Jews found a collective mission. Capitalists and socialists, Reform rabbis and Orthodox rabbis, Jews of widely different backgrounds and persuasions, all sat together at the Joint's meetings, reaching decisions by consensus. And you can see one of these early meetings on the screen. And what I particularly like about this picture, which is an early meeting of the JDC in 1915, is that you can see, take note of the Russian Jew right at the front, right? You can see his kippah, you can see his beard, and he's sitting right amidst all of these kind of, upscale, wealthy German guys. And then also at the table, a couple of women, shocker. This is a real blending of the community. You can see the Russians there, you can see the Germans there are women there. These are representatives from all different parts of American Jewish life, coming together, working together, and in doing so, establishing a pattern of community cooperation that would soon reach beyond the realm of philanthropy and endure for decades to come. What had been this immigrant community, divided by language and politics and culture, had started this kind of transformation into a more unified American Jewish community. The JDC, by the way, has an amazing website. And if you have never visited it, I recommend that you go there. The photographs in their archive section in particular are incredible. And I want to just share a few of them, a few of these images with you here tonight. If you want to check out this website for yourself, I have the address on the screen up there. And it's just really quite a marvelous historical resource. So the first image that you're looking at here is help that the JDC gave to children in Poland. Poland, as I said, is reconstituted after the First World War as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And many of the families, Jewish families who are living there, are quite ravaged by the events of World War I. So the JDC throughout the war, and then later also after the war, would provide meals for children at schools and nurseries in Poland. And there you see them eating a hot lunch in 1918. So beautiful little faces of children there. This image shows Jewish families lining up at that should say the JDC, the JDC's Dreyfus Soup Kitchen in Jerusalem in 1921, because Jews who were living in Palestine were also quite damaged as the Ottoman Empire fell apart during and after World War I. Their communities were damaged, their livelihoods were also hurt, and they needed quite a bit of help from the outside Jewish world. So you see a JDC-funded soup kitchen there. And then this one is really quite extraordinary. This is one of the JDC's transmission bureaus. And what happened here was that people could send money to their relatives and friends overseas in war-torn Europe. You couldn't send the money directly, right? Because the mail system wasn't working in places that were at war. It wasn't working properly. So what the JDC did is it would set up a transmission bureau here, and then it staffed transmission bureaus in war zones all over the world, and it would send the money from one of these transmission bureaus to another, and people could in that way get money to their families who were suffering abroad. So the JDC was really an incredible tool for the American Jewish community to be able to reach out and help other Jews who were suffering during World War I. All told, American Jews raised unprecedented sums for their suffering kin in war-torn Europe. $63 million was collected from the American Jewish community between 1914 and 1924 to help Jews abroad. The United States, of course, entered the war in April 1917. Most American Jews spoke out in support of the war. Many Americans of German origin, Jews and non-Jews, anglicized their names. Thousands of military-age Jews, immigrants, and their children volunteered to fight for America in this war. Jews constituted about 3.3% of the American population in 1917, and they furnished about 5% of its armed forces. There were 250,000 Jewish soldiers and sailors in World War I. The central community challenge posed by thousands of Jews in uniform was a religious one: how to meet diverse spiritual and welfare needs of American Jewish soldiers under war conditions. The Protestant soldiers had the YMCA. The Catholic soldiers had the Knights of Columbus. The military looked for a Jewish organization to stand alongside these Protestant and Catholic ones. Since existing Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith or even the Joint weren't geared to provide religious services, a new organization had to be created, and that organization was called the Jewish Welfare Board. Founded in 1917, and like the Joint, it reflected a once unimaginable level of religious cooperation among American Jews, a further demonstration of how the war forced leaders of radically different denominations and persuasions to work together. The Jewish Welfare Board was respectful of all Jews, but aware that the military recognized one Judaism. So the Jewish Welfare Board brought together representatives of each denomination at the time, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, to formulate a unified military prayer book. And you can see that prayer book, an image of it up on the screen, the abridged prayer book for Jews in the Army and Navy of the United States, first published in the year 1917, funded in part by the US government. And you can sometimes find copies around of these prayer books floating around even today. If you have one, let us know in the chat. The Jewish Welfare Board set the morale of Jewish soldiers as its highest goal and declared itself Jewishly nonpartisan. The Jewish Welfare Board set out to meet the religious needs of all of the Jews who were serving in the military, all Jewish soldiers, by providing a variety of services and holiday resources. So they would supply matzah for Passover and apples and honey for Rosh Hashanah, and even kosher food for those Jewish soldiers who required it. So here again, we see how American Jewish subcommunities can come together and start to work together. So World War I ends in November of 1918, and in its wake, the Jewish world is forever changed. The war's great upheavals altered the demographic map of the Jewish people. Whereas before the war, the Russian Empire had been the largest Jewish community in the world, right? We studied this in our first session together. 5 million Jews living in Russia in 1880. It's the largest Jewish community in the world. After World War I in 1918, where's the largest Jewish community in the world? It's right here. It's America. After World War I, the United States boasted the largest Jewish community in the world with 3.6 million Jewish residents here in 1920. What had previously been thought of as a kind of outpost community, certainly never thought of as the center of Jewish life and culture, was now the biggest, the wealthiest, and therefore arguably the most important Jewish community in the world. By the way, the second largest Jewish community in the world in 1920 was Poland. Poland is going to have, and this is how America gets the #1 position, right? Because all the Jews that formerly lived in Russia, like a good half of them, are now living in reconstituted Poland. Poland has 3 million Jews in the period between the wars, between World War I and World War II. America has 3.6 million Jews. So the United States emerges from World War I as the largest Jewish community in the world. And there's this wonderful map. It's a little hard to understand, but once you get it, I think it's pretty cool. You can see it up there on the screen. It shows the Jewish population of New York City at 1.5 million had come to exceed that of Western Europe, South America, and Palestine combined. All of those places can fit inside of New York, is what that map is showing you. So as the interwar period progressed, the American Jewish community was also increasingly native born. The community was comprised of people who were born here. In fact, by the 1930s, for the first time in more than a century, the majority of the American Jewish population was not born abroad. This is important for us. What does it? Because it tells us something. It basically tells us that immigration has stopped, that this kind of temporary period of transition, this time where the wave of Eastern European Jewish immigrants is arriving and they are settling and they are starting to adjust, that has ended. And it ended, why? Because of the introduction of immigration restrictions. And this is something that I mentioned during the first week, but I want to close with it tonight and speak about it a little bit more in depth so that we can understand its real consequences, both for Jews here and around the world. So the 1920s were an important turning point in American immigration policy. While the U.S. had, since its founding, served as a kind of haven for the tired and the poor, this shining beacon of hope and opportunity for immigrants, we really pulled up the welcome mat after World War I. The 1920s saw the passage of several defining pieces of immigration legislation, the final and most definitive one being the one that's named on your screen, the National Origins Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. The Johnson-Reed Act strengthened an emergency measure that had been passed 3 years earlier that imposed country-by-country quotas on immigration. These quotas were set at 2% of each nation's contribution to the 1890 population of the United States. So if you were a Jewish immigrant during this period, looking to come to the United States from Russia, from Germany, from Poland, from Hungary, from one of these places that had really been decimated by the First World War, the US would look at the number of Russians or Poles or Hungarians living in the US in 1890 and allow 2% of that number to enter per year. So why 1890? This was an attempt to restore America's ethnic makeup to what it had been before the bulk of these new immigrants arrived. The new immigrants in this case being the Catholics and the Jews, who made up millions of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who came between 1880 and 1924. By the way, Asians were barred entirely during this period. They didn't even get a quota. They were just flat out not allowed to come. All of these groups were considered essentially foreign and inassimilable. If you review State Department and congressional records from this period, you can see quite clearly the prejudice that motivated this legislation. In 1920, for example, the State Department issued a memorandum to Albert Johnson, chair of the House Committee of Immigration, in which the State Department summarized the characteristics of various immigrant groups seeking entrance to the United States. And here's what they have to say. This is just a brief example about Jews from Poland. Quote, Russian Poles or Polish Jews of the usual ghetto type. Most of them are more or less directly and frankly getting out of Poland to avoid war conditions. They are filthy, they are un-American, and they are often dangerous in their habits. End quote. Why are they dangerous in their habits? Because they are Bolshevik revolutionaries. You can read similar, really insulting material about Italians from this period, about Slavs, and about Russians who are not Jewish. The Johnson-Reed Act aimed to keep these undesirables out of the United States. This legislation hit Jews especially hard. So with Jews, for example, who were coming in numbers as high as 150,000 in 1907, they were reduced to 10,000 in 1924. And 5,000 Jews were allowed to come to the United States in 1931. And 3,000 Jews were allowed to come to the United States in 1932. These limitations caused great hardship, not just to European Jewish victims of persecution, but also to those who sought to bring members of their extended family to the United States. Even parents or siblings or grown children were not given privilege or priority. You couldn't get your relatives here. Later, when America faced economic crisis during the Great Depression, the already reduced immigration flow was further limited by another strict administrative measure, so that very few immigrants were admitted, even from relatively high quota countries like Germany. As a result, when Jews most needed refuge following Hitler's ascension to power in 1933, they found America's doors firmly closed to them. And so we come to the end of our time period, and actually also the end of our class, and we leave the American Jewish community, I think, in a really interesting position. We leave them as the largest, the wealthiest, arguably one of the most important Jewish communities in the world. But just as this newly minted superstar Jewish community is taking the world stage, they are faced with an unprecedented amount of nativism, racism, and anti-Semitism at home, as you can see from the Johnson-Reed Act with these immigration restrictions. So what happens next? This is the topic for winter of 2026, when we will hopefully meet again. But I don't want to end on a cliffhanger. So instead, I'm gonna finish with our usual slide tonight, which is our suggested sources for further study slide, in which I have a couple of oldies that I've already recommended to you, and then some new things tonight, especially this really excellent biography of Emma Lazarus that you can see on the screen, a very good scholarly book about World War I and the Jews, if you're the kind of person who likes to read academic histories, and then a very, very fun book about how Yiddish changed America and how America changed Yiddish. That's a collection of essays, and that's a really fun one. So as I said in the past, I am going to give Mark a list, a bibliography in the next week of all of the sources that I have mentioned over our weeks of class together. And then he can figure out how to make that accessible to all of you so that you have a page of resources to look for when you want to go out and learn more and go out and read more.